Hey guys, TheAirsoftTech here, and welcome back to Airsoft Tech Talk Q&A. As per usual, we won't waste any time, and we'll jump straight into your all's most interesting and most popular questions.
Samuel McLean asks, what are the key things that people mess up with a DSG build?
One of the biggest mistakes I see people make with DSG builds is they tend to not cut their tappet plate fin short enough. And so people will cut and shave, and they'll think, well, that looks okay, and it probably shouldn't be any shorter, when in reality it probably should be about a millimeter, 2 or 3 millimeters shorter to kind of close that gap more quickly, or to close your air nozzle into the hop-up chamber more quickly, so that you can get a higher FPS output and a better FPS consistency. So that's probably the biggest mistake I see people make. That and choosing the right tappet plate spring strength as well does play a big part in getting that FPS consistency and that FPS output really nice and tight.
JJ Moore Airsoft asks, bearings or bushings for a DSG build? I know bushings are slower, but curious if there are bearings tough enough for the stress of the DSG build.
Speaking of DSGs and the good old bearing versus bushing discussion, you guys know my opinion. I prefer bushings almost 9.5 times out of 10 for most of my builds. If you are going to use bearings for a DSG build, get some really nice J-caged bearings. Those are just significantly stronger than other bearings on the market. And even when you do use those bearings in your gun, in your DSG build, be sure to put a really solid steel bushing underneath the spur gear. This is where a lot of the gearboxes or the gear's rotational stress kind of rests, is the lower part of the spur gear. So you'll notice that if you shim a gun perfectly fine, put thousands and thousands of rounds through it, one of the first things that will break, if anything is going to break mechanically, is going to be that lower spur gear's bearing, just where a lot of stress is centered on. And so if you put a bushing there, you might be sacrificing some percentage of efficiency in your gear train, but ultimately you're making a significantly more reliable system. So if you are going to use bearings, do that. And if you're not going to use bearings, use bushings, and you're going to last nearly forever in the gear train component.
Tanner Reed asks, recommended gearbox shells for high rate of fire builds.
So if you're on an extreme budget, the gearbox shells that I really like for budget or stock builds are GMP and VFC. Both of those gearbox shells are really strong, really capable, really on spec, so they fit parts easily, and they're nice for stock parts. If you are wanting to go with a kind of mid-tier gearbox shell, Lonex V2, Lonex V3, those are pretty much the shells I go to nowadays for anything high stress, and I don't want to spend a lot of money. If you do want to spend quite a bit of money, you can go with a Retro Arms version 2 or version 3 gearbox shell. Both of those have a lot of really fancy features. They're made out of CNC'd aluminum. They have a quick change spring guide system. They're really, really tough, and the new generation ones are fairly on spec or very on spec. I've not heard of many people complaining about them. I haven't gotten my hands on one. I don't really spend a lot of money on a gearbox shell. Like I said, I tend to use Lonex V2 and Lonex V3. But from some of my tech friends that I'm in group chats with, I've not heard any problems with the newer Retro Arms gearbox shells. So in that tier, GMP, VFC, Lonex V2 and V3, and then the Retro Arms gearbox shells are top tier, really nice stuff.
Darren Martin asks, what is the biggest difference you have to overcome when doing a V3 build versus a V2 build?
For some reason, it's taken me about 37 or 38 takes to answer this question correctly. So I've got some notes written down here so that I can answer this question correctly finally. So I apologize if I look down to make sure I'm on the right track. So differences between a version 2 and a version 3. At first glance, you kind of look at them and you think, wow, these are vastly different pieces of equipment here. One is just a different shape. It's a little bit, longer, or it's a little bit taller, and one's a little bit more thin but thicker up front. And so you begin to think, how different are these, and what are the limits of each of them? So first thing I think about when I compare a version 2 versus a version 3 is the strength. A version 2 is going to be a little bit weaker inherently due to the design compared to a version 3. Version 2 has a little less front support than a version 3 does, making it a little bit weaker than the V3. So but you can radius the front end of your gearbox shell if you have a version 2, and that strength difference is pretty negligible for airsoft applications. And nowadays, most of our gearbox shells are very strong. Lonex V2 and Retro Arms V2 are extraordinarily strong gearbox shells, and they're very difficult to break. So the strength difference is pretty much negligible for our airsoft applications. The next thing I think of are the parts. Now, the parts are pretty similar throughout, but thinking about the trigger setups, the spring guides, cylinder heads are going to be a little different, stuff like that, and your tappet plate is going to be a little bit different, though you can convert your tappet plates to kind of work and be cross-compatible with a little bit of modification. Another thing I tend to think of is if I want to do a DSG build, for example, I tend to go with an M4 versus with a version 2 gearbox shell versus a version 3 gun, because most version 3 guns have longer air nozzles, except the AK, which tends to use a shorter air seal nozzle. So small differences in the parts like that. That one doesn't really apply as much because pretty much everything that exists to upgrade a version 2 exists to upgrade a version 3 nowadays, when that wasn't really the case 15 years ago. Another significant difference is the wire setups, is that the version 2 wire setup is much more internal versus the version 3 where it's more external. Most version 3s are going to be wired for like a front setup, but where most version 2s are wired for a rear setup, and it's easier to convert a version 2 from a rear wired setup to a front wired setup than it is to do the same thing for a version 3, in my opinion. The last one I have written down here is kind of, you could file that under parts, but really we're talking about the motor here. The motor angles and the way the motor attaches to the gearbox shell is significantly different on a version 2 versus a version 3. On a version 2, the motor kind of just sits in the hand grip of your AR and kind of loosely sits there, not attached to the gearbox shell like a version 3. So this means that it's a lot easier to shim a version 3 gearbox shell than it is to shim a version 2 gearbox shell. At least that's my opinion there anyway. So those are the significant differences between a version 2 and a version 3. Nowadays, I pretty much, years ago, I used to let the version 2 versus the version 3 dictate what build I wanted to do. If I wanted to do like a DMR or like a high strength, high stress build, I tended to go with a version 3 gearbox shell because I was so afraid of breaking the front end off of my version 2 gearbox shell. But nowadays, that worry is pretty much gone because, like I said earlier, most upgrade version 2 gearbox shells are strong enough to do everything you need them to do.
The Phoenix Craft asks, how can I build the most silent M4 AEG in the world?
So I've answered this question before. I just want to address it real quick. The best things you can do to quiet down your AEG is to make an extremely efficient, quick cycling system. So think high-speed gears, a high-torque motor, or average, torque capacity motor, like a 16 or 18 TPA motor. On top of that, use bearings. Perfect your shimming. It needs to be absolutely perfect. Moving up, under volume your setup. So as opposed to doing like a 1.5 to 1.8 to 1 cylinder to barrel volume ratio, go for like a 1.1, 1.2 to 1 cylinder to barrel volume ratio. And then from there you can kind of fill in foam and all the empty spaces in your gun if there are any, and that'll give you a very, very quiet gun. Alright guys, that's all the time I have today to answer questions. If your question did not get answered this time, I apologize, but I try to pick out the most interesting and the most upvoted questions to answer for each episode of Airsoft Tech Talk Q&A. So if yours did have a lot of likes and I didn't answer it this time, it's really probably because it's not something that I can quickly answer in 2 minutes. It's probably something that needs its own video. So fear not, hopefully I will get around to answering those most upvoted questions with a full video answer. And please comment down below if your answer to any of these questions varies from mine, or if your experience is different from mine. I like to see people's differing opinions and experiences, and if you have one, please post it down below and we can talk about it. Alright guys, thank you for watching. Please do the usual, like, comment, and subscribe. It definitely helps the channel out a lot. And if you're feeling up to it, please go visit the merchandise store where I have some Airsoft Tech themed stuff for you guys. But like I said, that's all the time I have today to answer questions. I'll see you guys on the next video of whatever the heck I'm doing. But until then, stay tuned, Techs.
stone.